Go. All right, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We're joined by Patrick Andendahl. He's the author of Deliverance from Stupidparty Land. Patrick, are you there?
I am here.
Hey.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Who is Patrick Andendahl?
Well, I write under that name, and I do that because I try and write in a style that avoids opinions, avoids being easily labeled as right or left, and I try and stick with facts and trends and numbers, because I feel like it's important for people to focus on the facts and not on the messenger. So I try and remain as anonymous as possible and take myself, or even my personal views to some extent, out of the equation.
I got you. And so what is your background? You call yourself a political commentator. What's your background?
Well, the background is obviously I'm multicultural. You can probably tell that. I spent half my life in the UK, half my life in the United States. My day job, as it were, when I'm not writing or blogging or doing tweeting, managing social media, my day job is reinsurance, which is the insuring insurance companies, which is obviously very much a job of looking at numbers and figuring out what the patterns suggest. I've always been somewhat political in the UK. I would have labelled myself as a conservative, as somebody who supported Margaret Thatcher at the time. And I've moved over to the United States and become increasingly horrified by the political dialogue that's been and the downhill trajectory the country's been on, especially since the year 2000.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Patrick, your website is stupidpartyland.com. People can go check out your work there. So the reason why I asked you to come on the show today, and I appreciate you for coming on at the last second for me, is about these bombings that we have, these pipe bombings, the mail bomber they're calling it, and it seems to be like a political motivation behind it. What do you see from your point of view?
Well, first, before we state anything else, we're still waiting for facts to come out.
Right.
So there's bound to be a degree of speculation. And having said that, my major take, which I write about in my blog last night, is this should come as no surprise. This is the direction the country's going in. Virtually every single act of domestic terror comes from the right. Having said that, maybe a third or maybe less of all acts since 2010 have been inspired by Americans being somewhat inspired by the Quran. So you have Americans inspired by Quran, or you have anti-abortion people, you have anti-government people. These are people committing domestic terror, and obviously the pattern will only increase since the election of Donald Trump, because he is obviously doing everything he can to encourage such acts of terror. Whether you show up at his rallies where he encourages people to beat up protesters and slap them around, or whether you see him encouraging Republican politicians to assault journalists, his overall demeaning, attitude towards journalists. You take his rationalization of the Charlottesville's white supremacist killings and rally there, refusing to really come out against what really being a Nazi is all about. So I think, and then obviously his own bad behavior, his own lack of integrity, his own attitudes towards women or whatever, means he's inspiring the right to become out in the open and more fascist and more violent.
So you're saying, coming from the perspective of someone who does like a numbers analysis, right, from your profession, that you've studied these numbers, and virtually all domestic terrorism is either inspired by the Quran, like you said, or is right-wing terrorism?
Well, I regard Quran terrorism as right-wing terrorism.
Really? Okay.
But it's about one-third Quran, maybe a bit more, and the rest other things like anti-abort, pro-life people who are really pro-death, obviously, and anti-government people. And there's an extreme hatred on the right towards virtually everybody other than their own little tribe, which will be an ever-reducing circle till they hate everybody but but themselves, and they'll end up self-loathing, and that's their future, I believe.
Then what would you say to the people, because I know we're going to get these comments, by the way, just so you know, my perspective, I'm an old yippie from New York City. I was an anarchist. I was a street, protester myself. But a lot of people listening to the show are right-wing in nature, and they would say to me, hey, Ed, what about Antifa, and what about Black Lives Matter, that they're terrorist organizations? What would you say to them?
I don't think Black Lives Matter have created many terrorist acts. I think there may have been a couple of revenge assaults on policemen. But having said that, if you look at police violence against blacks in this country, it's just absolutely despicable and very...
Go. All right, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. We're joined by Patrick Andendahl. He's the author of Deliverance from Stupidparty Land. Patrick, are you there?
I am here.
Hey.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. Who is Patrick Andendahl?
Well, I write under that name, and I do that because I try and write in a style that avoids opinions, avoids being easily labeled as right or left, and I try and stick with facts and trends and numbers, because I feel like it's important for people to focus on the facts and not on the messenger. So I try and remain as anonymous as possible and take myself, or even my personal views to some extent, out of the equation.
I got you. And so what is your background? You call yourself a political commentator. What's your background?
Well, the background is obviously I'm multicultural. You can probably tell that. I spent half my life in the UK, half my life in the United States. My day job, as it were, when I'm not writing or blogging or doing tweeting, managing social media, my day job is reinsurance, which is the insuring insurance companies, which is obviously very much a job of looking at numbers and figuring out what the patterns suggest. I've always been somewhat political in the UK. I would have labelled myself as a conservative, as somebody who supported Margaret Thatcher at the time. And I've moved over to the United States and become increasingly horrified by the political dialogue that's been and the downhill trajectory the country's been on, especially since the year 2000.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Patrick, your website is stupidpartyland.com. People can go check out your work there. So the reason why I asked you to come on the show today, and I appreciate you for coming on at the last second for me, is about these bombings that we have, these pipe bombings, the mail bomber they're calling it, and it seems to be like a political motivation behind it. What do you see from your point of view?
Well, first, before we state anything else, we're still waiting for facts to come out.
Right.
So there's bound to be a degree of speculation. But having said that, my major take, which I write about in my blog last night, is this should come as no surprise. This is the direction the country's going in. Virtually every single act of domestic terror comes from the right. Having said that, maybe a third or maybe less of all acts since 2010 have been inspired by Americans being somewhat inspired by the Quran. So you have Americans inspired by Quran, or you have anti-abortion people, you have anti-government people. These are people committing domestic terror, and obviously the pattern will only increase since the election of Donald Trump, because he is obviously doing everything he can to encourage such acts of terror. Whether you show up at his rallies where he encourages people to beat up protesters and slap them around, or whether you see him encouraging Republican politicians to assault journalists, his overall demeaning, attitude towards journalists. You take his rationalization of the Charlottesville's white supremacist killings and rally there, refusing to really come out against what really being a Nazi is all about. So I think, and then obviously his own bad behavior, his own lack of integrity, his own attitude towards women or whatever, means he's inspiring the right to become out in the open and more fascist and more violent.
So you're saying, coming from the perspective of someone who does like a numbers analysis, right, from your profession, that you've studied these numbers, and virtually all domestic terrorism is either inspired by the Quran, like you said, or is right-wing terrorism?
Well, I regard Quran terrorism as right-wing terrorism.
Really? Okay.
But it's about one-third Quran, maybe a bit more, and the rest other things like anti-abort, pro-life people who are really pro-death, obviously, and anti-government people. And there's an extreme hatred on the right towards virtually everybody other than their own little tribe, which will be an ever-reducing circle till they hate everybody but themselves, and they'll end up self-loathing, and that's their future, I believe.
Then what would you say to the people, because I know we're going to get these comments. By the way, just so you know, my perspective, I'm an old yippie from New York City. I was an anarchist. I was a street, protester myself. But a lot of people listening to the show are right-wing in nature. And they would say to me, hey, Ed, what about Antifa? And what about Black Lives Matter? That they're terrorist organizations. What would you say to them?
I don't think Black Lives Matter have created many terrorist acts. I think there may be in a couple of revenge assaults on policemen. But having said that, if you look at police violence against blacks in this country, it's just absolutely despicable and very rare for a policeman to be held accountable. And getting back to the Quran being right-wing, and Americans regard themselves as a Christian country, whereas clearly if you voted for Donald Trump, you cannot claim to be a Christian, and the definition of a Christian would be somebody who follows the teachings of Jesus Christ. So these people who've got so much hatred in their hearts, so much bigotry and ignorance, they're really following the wrong prophet. And I'm not saying Islam is a violent religion, but there's a bit more leeway with Islam to commit acts of non-violence, and that's where they should go. That's who they should convert to Islam if they really think they're religious.
You mentioned the possibility of some revenge, Black Lives Matter murders. I believe you're thinking of the Goforth murder, the police officer named Goforth. And if people actually look into that, they'll find out that there was a lot more involved in that case. Actually, his girlfriend was in the car with him at the time, and there seems to be a lot of personal dating involvement in that shooting, that Goforth case where the police chief came out and started talking about...
I don't think there's a pattern of Black Lives Matter creating acts of violence. But having said that, people who go on about Black Lives Matter in a critical fashion probably do not understand the very nature of racism. They'll be the same people who talk about reverse racism. Right. And really, if you're worried about reverse racism in America, you're really not understanding racial issues, because really the minority, the party without power, is rather questionable if they can be racist. It's the party in power that's responsible for racial tolerance.
And that's interesting, too, because I know in the notes here you talk about the rise in anti-Semitism.
Well, I noticed now I create there's a link on the blog post, but it's evidently gone up by 57%. Some article, I think it's the New York Times, mentioned that, since Trump's election. The notion that the Republican Party is not somewhat anti-Semitic in spite of their support for Israel is also highly questionable. Obviously, the more right-wing you get as any political force on the planet, the more anti-Israel Semitic you tend to become. And before the billionaire Jewish contributors like Aidan Sheldon started funding the Republican Party to such a massive extent because of their pro-Israel approach, Eric Cantor, who was the one Jewish Republican in Congress at the time, he basically said the Republican Party is basically anti-Semitic. And that's their core value. So it's a marriage of convenience. You have the Republican Party now trying to work with Netanyahu, who himself is a very dishonest individual, to undo the Iran deal.
Yeah, I've noticed myself from doing the show here the past 5 years, the dramatic increase in anti-Semitism and paranoid anti-Semitism in a way. And now with the use, it seems like the use of the phrase globalism, Trump is against globalism, that they're taking the term globalism and commingling it with anti-Semitism, which is really Jew hate, Have you noticed the same thing?
Well, I'm just saying, as you get the rise of any right-wing organization, you're obviously, and we're seeing again the rise of anti-Semitic attitudes.
Right.
It's not like there's any knowledge-based information going on in a Trump voter. I mean, what they're voting for is somebody who just said everything is great. There's no more substance than the word great in any plan he's ever proposed. But what he's getting, he's inciting the pitchfork mob. He's inciting the fearful conservative brain, and he's being very successful. This conservative brain, these people who support him, have virtually no knowledge. And if you go back to what were the 3 or 4 pillars of being a Republican in the past, that you and I could debate the merits of, but they were still pillars of an intellectual compass. Those pillars would have been strong national security, would have been free trade, and I always forget the third one. But the point is that since Trump took over, those pillars of being conservative have just been destroyed. I mean, you can't have strong national security if all your allies loathe you. In terms of fiscal discipline, you can't have fiscal discipline if you just willy-nilly massively inflate the debt at a time when you have inflationary pressure. The time for increasing the national debt is when you're worried about deflation, not inflation. So you're going to see the repercussions of inflating an overheated economy probably within the next 12 to 18 months. But anyway, the point is, that's what they stand for, reducing the debt. And of course, the moment they ever get into power, they massively spend because they're basically fundamentally greedy and myopic.
What would you say to the people, though, that say, well, Ed, he's fighting the globalists, and he's a nationalist, and he's out for our best interest?
What does that mean?
Good question.
It's just words and labels bundled up together to appear as an intelligent thought. There's no intelligent thought there. Obviously, if humanity is to survive and progress, humanity needs to be more in lockstep rather than divided into 1,000 different great tribes. Being great is just for small people, small-minded people. You want to be as good as you can, but you don't necessarily have to do that at the expense of humanity or humanity's chances of surviving the next 100 years, which is quite questionable right now.
What other kind of areas do you cover in Deliverance from Stupidparty Land?
Well, obviously, this is the third book in what has turned out to be, and hopefully final, in what's a trilogy. So the first book was Stupidparty Massively Myths, where I debunk virtually every aspect of what the Republican Party has been standing for, whether it's on, and also talking about race, religion, agriculture, basic economics, trickle down versus supply side versus trickle up. So I spent that time debunking that. And then I made one little minor error in the introduction of that book where I wasn't overly negative on George Bush Sr., and that was pointed out to me by various people. And I did a lot of research, and I realized what a dreadfully Machiavellian politician George Bush Sr. was. And I tried to tackle it via blogs, but it was too complicated. But eventually, when Jeb Bush ran, I could use him as a proxy to study the Bush family. And so I wrote the second book, Jeb and His Horrendously Horrible Histories. And then because, I didn't want those two books to become out of date, I then thought, let's have the salute. Let's figure out, how did we get here? What's wrong with mankind that the Americans specifically could elect such an awful human being? So that goes not just to America, but Homo sapiens. How are we as a race so easy to manipulate as a species? And then try and come up with solutions. And the solution is the actual solution is very easy. That it's a solution that 80% of Americans would agree with. It's not polarizing at all. But then I'm the first to recognize that Americans really become the electorate has become too passive. And I'm somewhat cynical about the ability to reverse basic trends that are really destroying the country. The most obvious trend would be income discrepancy trends in the last 30 years. The question I ask everybody is just imagine those trends continue for the next 30 years. What must happen to American democracy? Well, it's highly questionable whether America's democracy right now. Most people would describe it as an oligarchy. Yeah. But clearly, if the trends carry on, it's going to become a lot worse and some sort of hybrid democracy oligarchy. It's going to turn into a fascist state if you have 3 or 4 people with all the monetary power. I mean, right now you have 100 people controlling 50% of political contributions. That's only going to get narrower and narrower and narrower. And these oligarchs have basically bought up democracy. every politician, every congressman has to spend 5.5 hours raising money. Clearly, they're not remotely interested in being tuned into the opinions of the electorate. They're 100% tuned into the opinions of the people they're raising money from.
Yeah, I talk about it all the time. The 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune, control 40% of this country's assets, equal to, yes, But do you see any way to reverse this trend? It's short of...
I do.
Yeah, okay, good. Tell us.
I'm not going to get too specific because it'd be too easy to nitpick, and I don't like sound bites, but I spend a lot of time explaining it.
Okay.
But what I'm seeing is some very interesting trends that nobody else has spotted. And what I'm looking at is looking at the wealth accumulation in, say, the 30 wealthiest American individuals. And if you look at the wealth, look at who those individuals were back in 1985, compare it with those individuals now in 2018, and then project where those numbers will look in 2025, you'll start seeing some fascinating numbers. Back in 1985, it was basically the wealth was controlled by old fossils, oil-type people and maybe retail bricks and mortar type people. And then a lot of this wealth came out of the Midwest, the Koch brothers and all the rest. And that's changing. I mean, they had like 85% of that pot of wealth, and maybe only 15% would be to people who'd be more benign, the Hewlett-Packards of this world who really care about humanity and the planet and really have set up legacies to handle those issues. Now, if you look at the wealth distribution today, it's dramatically different. It's now the polar opposite. And by 2025, it will be 85% of the money will be more Silicon Valley type people, people in tech, what you've got the FANG type companies. And these people, even though you take the piss about their morality, but if you look at the TV show, I think it's called Silicon Valley, where they are up against various sort of backstabbing type incidents, but at the end of the day, they still look to try and help humanity. Now, they may be misplaced in many ways, like Mark Zuckerberg. I think he's still trying to figure it out. But at the end of the day, they're the ones who might do what's necessary here. I mean, they may have to step in as white knights to do what the Americans aren't prepared to do, the voters not prepared to do. Because the solution is take money out of politics, but Americans right now are not willing to spend the money. It's not very expensive, by the way, to do it. So these people could actually step in place in the year 2000, in 5 years' time, and maybe buy back democracy and then take out their own power. And you do that by basically doing the game now in reverse. You pay off the politicians. And if they don't play ball, they don't get elected. They don't get any money. And we could come up with 10 times more money than the old fossils. And even if you take some of the worst old fossils, like Sheldon Adelson, he would be the first to admit that this system is wrong. He shouldn't be able to buy his own president, but if he can, he will. So even somebody like that, who's on the very opposite side of the scale, might actually be willing to support a total realignment of political power in this country.
But Patrick, you're saying that we have to rely on the good intentions and the goodwill of people like Mark Zuckerberg.
I'm slightly cynical. I mean, I think that I'm slightly cynical about the passivity of the electorate. I think things have gone so far to the right that being in the middle, where people want to be, maybe, is pretty pathetic. And I think a lot of people fall for some of the overwhelming propaganda on the right, which is, there's people still going on endlessly about Hillary's emails, or whatever it might be. Not only is that water under the bridge, but even progressives don't really understand that issue, and they still believe there's something wrong with her charitable foundation. There's nothing wrong with the charitable foundation. The Republicans have wasted over $100 million in taxpayer money trying to derail, and they did Clinton with these scandals. Nothing ever showed up at the expense as a result of that $100 million of wasted taxpayer money. Every time you have an election, the candidate who runs the Republican Party, whether it be McCain in 2008 and Romney in 2012, they have every right to look at their opponent and make sure that they're qualified to live in that country, haven't done anything wrong. So they can then They can investigate. That's fine. But once that's been done, it was done. McCain decided not to go after, say, Obama's birth certificate in 2008, and same with Romney. At some point, these guys on the right have got to give it up because, especially on radio, it's hate radio primarily in the United States. They just keep going on and on about these conspiracy theories. And at some point, and they've had every means possible to prove themselves right. They've had a tremendous amount of resources and money to prove themselves right. They never can, and they never will.
Well, you've looked into the Clintons' behavior in like Haiti and what happened to all the Haitian relief funds and stuff like that. You have no problem with that?
I've not researched the Haiti relief funds. I have researched the emails.
The emails,
I've researched a foundation and some other aspect. I think I've researched 3 different areas that I've been concerned, that people were concerned about. I've not specifically looked into Haiti.
Okay.
I can't comment on that.
Now, and again, and when you say like the left, you think like the Democrats would get us income equality?
No, I mean the Democrats are less progressive than the English Conservative Party.
Right. See, because I'm a socialist myself, so I would say.
You've got to be very careful. That's such a you've got to be very careful with that word because Americans don't understand it. Because the word socialist runs the gamut between North Korea, and I doubt if you support the North Korean approach, or it runs the gamut between North Korea to Finland to the UK or whatever you want to Bernie Sanders. If you take Bernie Sanders, who's considered the most left-leaning outlier in the Senate, what of his views are peculiar? The only thing you could debate is whether one should have university education for all. That's something you and I could debate until the cows come home, and I don't have the answer. But if you're talking about universal health care, that's a no-brainer. If you look at the maths, there's no argument against it. The only reason Obama could not put it through properly because of the massive wealth of the insurance industries and the pharmaceutical companies said, basically, if you want our support, you're going to have to do something different other than single payer.
What I would advocate is the nationalization of the oil industry, which, of course, Bernie is not. And something, we have $200 $200 billion a year in oil profits, right? The oil comes from, it's a natural resource, it's a national resource that we should all share in those profits, right? And this would be something dramatic that we could have right away. But
okay, let's talk about oil.
Go ahead.
Because I like talking about oil. It's the root cause of everything I stand for since the age of 18. America's original sin, and this is all of Americans, from the 20th century onwards, i.e. putting aside slavery, would be the acceptance of an infantile and deadly oil policy that's led to all of our problems today. Now, I'm actually happen to be and if you want to nationalize, there's no reason why America should ever have had to import any oil at all. But by supporting and framing governments in the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia, that's how you funded virtually all forms of radicalization of Islam. But I'm actually quite bullish about oil right now, in that I believe it's over. The game is done, game, set, and match, but nobody quite knows it yet. So the demand for oil, I think, will start collapsing within a few years, because the economies surrounding how you build old technology of clean energy against fossil technology have now reached the tipping point. The numbers behind electric vehicles have now reached parity, and the moment a company like Tesla can start producing cars in a larger volume and the other competitors catch up, they're going to be massively better than an ICE engine, an internal combustion engine. These electric cars, the new ones, and the semi-truck, they'll have a longevity of 1 million miles, so that they won't have, so their depreciation costs, the cost of ownership will be massively less than an internal combustion engine. And I think that difference in the price point, which has now reached parity, will massively change in favor of clean energy.
But once again, Patrick, you're saying to me that out of the goodness of his heart, Tesla's going to take all these problems away from us.
Well, he's an unusual guy if you talk about Elon Musk.
Yeah, Elon, right.
He clearly doesn't care about making tons of money for himself. He's willing to gamble everything time and time again on his vision. And he has 2 fundamental visions. One is to remove mankind's dependency on oil. And his second vision is the plan B, that if we do destroy this planet, maybe we have somewhere to go to.
Okay, we're really, really running out of time. But again, I'm a born-again Christian. I used to be involved in the ministry and stuff like that. And I'm also a socialist as well. And so many people will hear that, their heads explode. Well, how can you be a Christian and also be a socialist at the same time?
Can I explain that?
Yes, there you go. Please do.
Well, okay, trickle up, which would be a more Christian approach, is basic fundamental Keynesian economics. So trickle up, if it's handled correctly, would be 700% more stimulative to the economy than supply side than trickle down. And most economists would argue it's 200% more stimulative, but the reason why they get it wrong is because they take the top 50% of Americans against the bottom 50% of Americans, which is not the American problem. The American problem is it's the top 1%, the top 5%, whatever. So if you took the top 1% and compare it with the bottom 20%, and you help the bottom 20% at possibly at the expense of the 1%, you would see it would be 700% more stimulative than what the Republicans have just done now with their tax cuts for the wealthy.
Patrick,
of course it works better, and it will allow the oligarchs to sell more goods to people who can afford to buy their products.
It's so true. If we would have just decreased it'd be the hugest economic stimulus in the history of this country.
Food stamps does a tremendous amount of good.
That is so true.
For stimulating the economy. And actually, if you look at the counties that rely most on food stamps, they're like 95% white.
Mr. Andendall, we're out of time. The book is called Deliverance from Stupidity Land, and also the website, again, is called Stupidparty Land. It's Stupidparty Land, stupidpartyland.com. Mr. Andendall, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, well, there we had Patrick Andendall, and once again, his website is stupidpartyland.com. I kept calling it Stupidity Land, but it's Stupid Party Land, and the book is Deliverance from Stupid Party Land. I'm going to have him back when we have some more time to spend with him, but we'll be right back after these messages.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Check out cartking.com, 877-986-7771. Have you ever thought about opening your own mobile cart or kiosk business? Perhaps your current business wants to add multiple point-of-sale locations across the country quickly. Maybe the facility you manage could kickstart revenue by adding coffee, food, or retail services, like let's say you own an office building or a warehouse. Put one of these carts there in the lobby. Well, cartking.com can be the answer to your needs. Cartking.com is a North American designer and manufacturer of the finest mobile retail coffee and food carts and kiosks money can buy. For 20 years, CartKing.com has been working with clients and corporations across America to provide indoor and outdoor carts and kiosks for any application. From large, heated, and secure outdoor retail or food kiosks to smaller, more mobile coffee kiosks or coffee stations, coffee carts, CartKing.com designs and builds them all. Carts and kiosks are fun, and so are the dozens of designs on the website, cartking.com. Please visit today at cartking.com or just call them at 877-986-7771. Tell them Ed Opperman sent you and you get a good deal. Remember, all these shows on Awake are brought to you by emailrevealer.com. You can go to emailrevealer.com and get a copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. You also do all the kind of different services for you. Online dating service investigations called an online infidelity investigation. And that's where you give us your husband or your boyfriend, your girlfriend's email address, and we trace it back to their online dating websites, and we return a list of all the dating sites that email is registered to. We can expand on that investigation and trace it back to porn sites, escort service sites, swinger sites, gambling websites, and even prescription drug websites, and all kinds of digital forensics, computer and cell phone digital forensics, where we can recover deleted content from an email or a hard drive and produce a report for you that you can use in court. That's emailrevealer.com, or you can contact me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. The Opperman Report is brought to you by SubhashTechnosis.com. Subash Technosis is a search engine optimization and website design company. They're located in India, so you know you're going to save a lot of money and get top quality service. They offer all sorts of business process outsourcing, data entry, banking BPO services, recruitment process outsourcing, software testing, offshoring, research network, customer care, press release, content writing and distribution, and much, much more. Now, you can get a hold of Subash Technosis by email at info@subhashtechnosis.com. Their website is www.subhashtechnosis.com, and their Skype is ANUSHASUBASH.